Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited because tonight I have one of my BookTube besties, Lady Jane Books, here to
Hi.
discuss The Wolf and the
Wolf and the
Watchman, which
Watchman.
was January's read for the Black Hearts Book Club. And hello, Jane. You dressed for the occasion. You wore
Hi.
black. I should have.
I did. Black Hearts Book Club. Hi, Carrie. I am so excited to be here. I always have the best time buddy reading with you and with the Black Hearts Book Club. And we started off the year with a bang. Wow.
You know,
Wow.
it can only go up from here, pretty much, as far as the dark factor. It was pretty dark. It was pretty
Oh,
dark.
man. It was midnight dark.
I think Steven pretty much nailed it. He said the book that emotionally wrecked our stoic Carrie. Got to see what this is all about. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Good to see some folks in
Mason.
the chat. Mason,
Hi, Mason. Oh, train.
Sam.
Hi,
Yeah, and
Sam.
this one was really, really dark.
It was so much. Hey, Jason.
Jason. So I guess we will start with just your overall impressions of the book, Jane. Any initial reactions to this one?
I was not prepared. I was not prepared for this. So, okay. I will start off with saying, as a whole work, I did really enjoy the book. I liked the way that it was written. I loved the setting and how descriptive the setting was. And our characters were so interesting. So, as an overall experience, loved it. That being said, wow, this book is extra dark. Like I honestly was not expecting that. I think this has to be one of the darkest books that I have ever read. And I like the dark books. And so it was very, very shocking, and some of it was like really disgusting. Like it had that really revolting type of reaction for me. But I'm so surprised because even though there were those instances, I think it was a very well written book. What did you think, Carrie?
It was amazing. I mean, this book, Stephen is right in the chat. This book did affect me. I'm not one who really thinks about books that much like after I've read them. Like I think about them while I'm reading them, but I don't necessarily like think about them as I'm trying to fall asleep. Like that
Mhm,
never bothers me.
mhm.
So I can read horror, I can read pretty grim books before I go to bed and I'm completely fine. I don't, get nightmares or anything like that. But I have to admit that with this book, I was laying in bed one night and I just had the weirdest feeling. It was just an unsettled feeling because I kept thinking about the murder victim in this book
Mhm,
and the way he was just completely violated and treated in such a way that, his humanity, bit by bit, literally, like piece by piece, limb by limb, is taken from him. It just it gave me just the creepiest sensation. I had to just watch some like random funny YouTube videos for a little bit just to kind of get my mind off of it because it was really dark. But
yeah.
like you said, it was a very well written book. It was very fast paced. And it was one of those books that I wanted to pick back up. I wanted to see what was going to happen. And um, I think with this type of book, that's kind of hard to do because it is
Mm,
also historical. So I understand, it's a murder mystery, and we're kind of used to some of those being fast paced, but it was really um, pretty heavy on the historical part without
mm.
it being
Boring.
distracting or boring. Like I think sometimes books try to do too much with the historical aspect and they get kind of bogged down in it, and that's coming from someone who really enjoys history. So, I feel like this book did a great job of balancing the two.
Mm. What I my initial thoughts is that it was very much like The Alienist, where it had that really like historical backdrop, and you knew what was going on and the times they were living in. but at the same time, it was just so engrossing because these characters melded so well with that entire setting as well. But at the same time, they popped with their own storyline. And so I think I said in the chat when we first started, I'm getting the Alienist vibes, and the Alienist is one of my favorite stories. So I'm really glad that we were able to get a book with a similar type of vibe.
Yeah, I've never read The Alienist. I've seen the TV show, and
I've seen the
I
TV
loved
show.
it.
I haven't read it, but yeah.
So yeah, so I need to read that one too. Cabe Cotter was actually in the book club with us, and he says he didn't think it was gratuitously dark though. He thought it added to the atmosphere and showed how evil the crime was. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it was extremely gory, and but it didn't feel, like you say, it didn't feel like it was just there for the shock factor. I think it was part of the story.
I think also it was just, I don't want to say it was realistic, but it tried to give a very realistic feeling for this times, with the executions and for the public health, and sickness, and it was very, very dark, but that was the reality of the time. And so I think what made the gross parts work was that it was so matter of fact that it wasn't there for a shock factor. It wasn't there to, get in the reader's face. It was simply a stating a fact of the presence of life at that time.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And just for those who haven't read up on the book, it is set in 1793 in Stockholm, Sweden. And so we do have the backdrop of, the French Revolution has just happened. I believe the Swedish king has been assassinated at some point previously. So it's kind of a volatile political time, which is interesting. And it really does play into the story and to the characters. But also, I found something else interesting. At the beginning of each little section of the book, there were poems.
I don't know if you remember that. Right.
Yeah.
I had it on audiobook, so it was like a chapter opener. I didn't realize it was like its own thing. So that's cool.
So I thought that was kind of cool too, because I think that gives us kind of a little bit of a peek into what's happening in the era, because it is a time of the Romanticism, movement in literature and art. So you do see a little bit of a peek at that, which I thought was pretty neat. And poor Mason, he said he'd have no chance. He already gets bad dreams. Yeah, Mason, you probably should not read this one. This one was pretty bad.
Maybe next time, but not this one.
And I would be very interested to see what you think about this book because of how dark it is. I would really like to see your opinion on this.
And I think Anne likes history too. Like, she's always talking about like historical fiction books and reading, nonfiction history. So I would be very interested as well. But fair warning, Anne, though, it gets dark.
Yes. So I guess my first question, because I don't want to get into spoilers right away, so I'm trying to, which is hard. But the title of the book, The Wolf and the Watchman, what did you think about the title? Did you give any significance to the wolf? And of course, we know the Watchman, one of our main characters, Mikhail Cardell, he's a watchman who actually discovers the victim's body floating in the water. So we know, and there are several other Watchmen characters in the book as well. But what did you think about the significance of the title there?
It's funny you ask that, because I actually see it a little bit ambiguously. So I know we're supposed to think that Wenger, I don't know how to say his name. What was his first name? The detective.
Cecil Winge.
Cecil.
Was it Cecil?
Cecil, that's it. So I know we're supposed to think of Cecil as the wolf, and then obviously the Watchman is Cadell. But I actually think you could argue that they're interchangeable. So Cecil seems a little bit more like the Watchman, a little bit more like observant, and a little bit more about what's going on around him. And then Cardell is definitely more wolfish because of his like brassness, his strength, and his kind of like fighting attitude. So I thought it was really interesting that you could argue that it could be the opposite. It's not the obvious setup. What do you think, Carrie?
That's a really interesting point you make there, because I was kind of going to circle to that point eventually, I think, with my thoughts on it.
Sorry, I just totally skipped your entire presentation.
Like,
so sorry, Carrie.
And I promise Jane and I didn't discuss this. I don't even really have any questions like created. I'm on the post drone of a migraine attack, so I didn't have time to prepare like anything. So we didn't plan that at all. But yes, I think I want to say somewhere in the book there was a quote, and of course I didn't find it before the show, but there's a quote about people being wolves. And essentially, basically being a dog eat dog world, and how at some point, I think the point of it, obviously the most apparent connection would be to the killer, right? That the killer is a wolf and the killer is the hunter. But I think there is a statement there about just humanity, and that we can all be wolves, because in the end of the book, without giving too much away, I think we discover a few things about our detective, Cecil Winge, that reveal to us that he is not necessarily the pillar of honesty and integrity and justice and all of the things,
That is a good point, Carrie.
And yeah, I really liked that title.
Brilliant.
And Mason said it's very evocative. Yeah, it is a very intriguing sort of title.
And I like that you put that that discussion about humanity there, because during one of the scenes, and this is early on, so I don't mind talking about it now, but one of the characters passes by a public execution at the time, and he's just kind of struck about the masses of people here to see this as almost a type of sport. And then you pan back to see the suffering of the poor individual, and the whole process. And that's one of the scenes that actually really bothered me, because of that lack of humanity. That even afterwards they were like gathering up materials because there was like medicine, so it was like this total dehumanizing this individual who's going to their death in such a barbaric way. It really bothered me. So, and you could argue that that was just one of the instances in this book that illustrates that we're a mix of humanity and sometimes not, especially in this setting.
I agree. And, I think we discover throughout the book that the Watchman, I think when you see that word, you would think, oh, it's a protector. It's someone who is watching over us. But more times than not, the Watchmen we encounter in the book are actually pretty evil. And they're using their position of power as a way to play out violent sort of fantasies that they have.
Sadistic.
And yeah, very sadistic. So it's I guess that's just another illustration that we all, I guess, have that sort of wolf like tendency in us. And yeah, with the public execution, I remember you talking about that, and how just that bothered you. That was one of the scenes that bothered you. And it another aspect of the book that I think really bothered me was I forget what the name of the place was, but it was basically this elite club that was run by this little secret society, and it was supposed to be like a little secret society of philanthropists and very prominent figures within the city. And we learned that it's kind of a facade, that they put on these airs. They give money to all of these, poor houses, but behind the scenes, they actually have a private club where, very crazy, sadistic, evil things are going on. And yeah, I think that too, just that got to me.
Yeah, I do agree. And I do recall what the situation you were talking about. And that was another instance where it just kind of hit you with how wild this book was. Like, I wasn't expecting that either. So
Yeah, I was definitely not expecting that.
now,
Well,
Carrie, I did. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I had a question actually. What did you think of the structure of The Wolf and the Watchman, like the timeline and how it's written?
Because it does go back and forth between our characters, and there is a bit of a time jump too with our character Christopher, if I remember right, because we're going back and seeing.
Yeah.
And usually I really hate that. I mean, I usually hate that because it kind of messes up the flow for me of books. But I think because this one was so fast paced, it really didn't bother me as much. And because we had so many interesting characters, I think that's one reason why I didn't really notice it as much. And our main character, Cecil Winge, he's a judge who is a former judge who is towards the end of his life. He is suffering from tuberculosis, and he is literally, like, each chapter you're wondering, will this guy make it to the end? Like, is he even going to be around to find justice for this victim? And I feel like his momentum kind of carries the book.
Definitely.
I'm guessing maybe you didn't like the time jump and stuff.
I actually did. I mean, like with any book that has time jumps, they do take, when they first begin and they introduce a new character, it takes a little getting used to. But this book had just such great characterization that I was like you, I didn't mind it because I'm like, ooh, what's happening with Anna now? Ooh, what's happening with Cecil? And so every single chapter, it kept me reading for that particular person's story. And I think it was really brilliant the way that the author broke it up, because these seem like so random. You know what I mean? They seem like a bunch of random people in the city, and you have no idea how they connect. And then you're watching, and it's just fascinating the way that this was structured. Like, I would have never guessed the way that they're all connected. And it was just so well thought out, and it was just so interesting that I think that also added to our excitement for reading this book.
Yes, I agree. Cape Codder said he thought it added to the suspense. Kind of made you feel uncertain. Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely had anxiety building inside of me. There were a couple of scenes in particular where there's one scene with Anna towards the end when I'm like, I know what she's going to do, and I just really hope she doesn't do this. And I was so anxious about it. I was worried about that character. You know what I mean?
It caused me stress. It caused me a lot of stress, this book. I got new gray hair from this book, Carrie.
Well, Mark from Book Time with Elvis, he suggested this book to me, and he'd already read it, but he said, I think you'll like this. I think it'll be good for Black Hearts Book Club. But he did warn me. He told me, he said, I don't know, though. He said, it is very, very grisly. Like, this is, he said it was the most disturbing book he'd ever read. So, I'd been warned. But I think it was worth it. It was definitely worth it.
Definitely. Yeah. I would not, I would not see that as a deterrent for someone who's really passionate about reading. This book is an experience. You know what I mean? It's an experience not for everyone. I saw somebody actually refer to this book saying, this is the type of book you have to choose to read rather than have it be chosen for you. And yeah, I know. And then I'm like, ooh, Carrie. But I mean, for someone not in a book club, if you're thinking about reading this, definitely kind of do your due diligence before diving into it. But for looking at it as a whole work and as a writing piece, I have to say it is one of the most brilliant books that I have read in a long time.
And there is a sequel.
There is, and I'm excited, and I'm wondering, although I am on a no buy, but I'm wondering about it.
They never last, Jane. Come on now.
Stop it. I'm like 20 days in. Stop it. Something else that I found really interesting is that I thought it was brilliant having a main character who was not well. and so not well that he was going to pass away.
Yes.
And not even just like in a really like gentle way, but in a very brutal way. I thought that I don't see that a lot in literature. Maybe I don't read the right books to see it. But I really liked seeing that type of inner turmoil from somebody who's focusing so hard on trying to solve a crime and yet also knowing that his time is limited. I thought that was a really, really interesting aspect to this book. What did you think, Carrie?
Yes, and I'll mention his partner here. I think the dynamics between Wynne Cardell was pretty brilliant because when the book opens, this Cardell figure is extremely unlikable. I mean, he
Mhm.
is a layabout. He's a drunk. He's not doing his duty. He is just a hot mess. I mean, he is. He's awful. And I think with Winge, they develop a friendship, they develop a partnership, and we get to see a different side of Cardell, and we get to get a peek into kind of why he is the way he is, and also why he's so invested in finding out who murdered our victim. Because when he goes to retrieve the body from the water, he's having like flashbacks to his time in military service when he lost his arm and he lost some of his friends. And so I think, with Cecil Winge, he's found a new partner. And so we get to see that relationship develop. And it makes him a little, I mean, he's definitely not a likable character per se, but it makes him more likable having that partnership. And it is a very realistic picture, I think, of what someone dealing with that type of illness would go through with Cecil. There are pretty vivid descriptions of what that looks like when he is coughing up blood. And there are days in the book when he is pretty much absent from the investigation because he's bedridden. So yeah, I liked that duo. But who was your favorite character in the book?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a hard one because I liked each character in a different way. I really liked Cecil because of how he was like struggling, and that sounds horrible, but I liked Cecil's exploration of how he was struggling personally. I really was invested in Anna's story. Like from start to finish, I just knew this wasn't going to be good for this girl, and I was just really impressed with how, even though she had literally everything against her, she still would have felt empowered enough to kind of pursue her own escape in a way. And so, even though things got pretty bad for her as well, I was so invested in rooting for her that I really really enjoyed her character.
Yeah, she was really interesting because all of her hardships really start because she sticks to her principles. I mean,
Yeah.
basically, she is going to be arrested by a Watchman because she doesn't give in when her supposed lifelong friend tries to force himself on her. And then he makes up a story that, she was basically some tart, trying to, you know, seduce him. And so she ends up in all of this trouble. And, she really stuck to her guns. And I, it's always interesting to me when people stay true to their principles, even in the face of very dire consequences.
Mhm.
Because, especially given the time period, I think most girls would have just seen that boy, because he wanted to marry her, right, as her only option. I mean, her mother was dying, or may have even passed at that point. I
I think
can't
she had
remember,
passed that.
but so I mean,
She
she
had just
really
passed
didn't
away too,
have.
which is crappy
Yeah,
timing on the boy's part, just
yeah,
saying.
that was
But
just super super
it was
weird.
not good.
But it she really didn't have any options. So for her to really stay true to herself, I'm just always fascinated by that, because, you never know what you would do in a set of given circumstances. and in a particular time period, when, you know, there are all of these social constraints on you. So yeah, her character was super interesting to me, as well. And yeah, she gave me a lot of anxiety because, again, I was really worried about her.
I
But I
personally
think,
think. Go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I want to hear your thought. Go
We're
ahead.
like the same. We're like the same.
We
We're
are. It's
probably
really
about to
sad.
say, we're probably about to say the same thing, Jane.
I really like. I personally think that her storyline had the most suspense, even from this whole like murder mystery type of thing, and even all the like other gore details. Her her story in particularly caused me a lot of stress, and because it just was so hard for her from the very beginning to literally the very end of the book, like the last couple pages. And you just kept on rooting for her to be like, it's going to get better. And then once things might get better, but they're not really better. So I personally think that of all the storylines, hers was probably the most suspenseful for me.
Yes, and I think even her story, it illustrates the point of that we can all become wolves,
Mm.
because, you know, towards the end, I think she takes out some pretty hefty retribution against someone. I'm not going to go into the details of how she does that. You'll have to read the book, but she does that, and she also has situations where she has to lie and be deceitful, and she does those things because she has to do them to survive. So I mean, you know, under a given set of circumstances, I think we can all you know, succumb to those things. I don't know that she's my favorite character. I still think that Cecil is my favorite
Mm.
character because there were so many layers to his story that we discovered throughout the book. And I don't want to give everything away right now, but there's a situation with his wife,
Mm.
and there are certain things that he does and situations that he manufactures and manipulates to essentially spare his wife the trauma of having to see him die, because she has been nursing him and, you know, staying by his side, and he loves her so much that he
Mm.
is even willing to essentially deliver her to another man, basically on a silver platter, to try to spare her. And I thought that was just so uncommon and unbelievable, and just it made my heart break for him. You know, it just yeah, I don't know. That whole storyline really
Yeah,
got to
I
me.
think, and another interesting part of this book is that towards even the end, we saw even another layer of that story too, which we weren't expecting. So I thought, I agree. I think that was, it provided a lot of depth into him and exactly how far he would go for someone that he loves. But at the same time, he did some other things as well that were terrifying. So I think he's a very complex character, and I think that's why we both enjoyed him.
Yes, for sure.
You know who else is really good?
Who?
Blix. I liked
Oh,
Blix. Okay, he wasn't my favorite, especially at that opening, but I liked Blix. Okay,
well, okay, here's the funny thing with
you have
Blix.
a clue. Okay, poor man's
Here's
not
the
working with
funny thing with
much.
Blix. So Blix showed up, Christopher Blix, he shows up kind of early on in the book. And this is like right after the point where I have been completely traumatized. Okay. So I'm
Yep.
like, you know, down in it. And then
Excuse
appears
me.
Christopher Blix. And
Mm,
Christopher Blix has this sunny outlook and disposition. His description of Stockholm, I was like, wow, is this even the same city? Because the previous description, it was basically like, you know,
black hole.
the darkest gutter you've ever, you know, seen. And then he, you know, appears and it's this remarkable city. And I'm just like, how is this even the same city? And I even commented in the chat, I was like, I am so happy to finally have a little comic relief and a little positivity in this book. And then, of course, what does Lady Jane do? But she puts the seed in my head that, Oh no, Carrie. I think he's probably the victim.
Well, because they said the blonde hair too, and I was like,
They did. So, and
don't get
then
attached, Barry. Don't get
that
attached.
that added to my anxiety because
This
then
is the
I'm like,
Blackhearts Book
oh
Club.
my
We don't
gosh,
get attached to the characters.
we can't get attached.
No.
But yeah, he was kind of interesting. He's a character that I think it's easy to feel sympathy for because of what happens to him in the end, and how what he does, the horrific things that he does or that he sees will haunt him. I mean, he's never recovered from that.
And he wouldn't anyway. Not
Yeah.
Not dramatic. Without assistance or anything like that.
A fair warning too, guys, for anyone out there who has not read this book. There are several.
This book doesn't. I love how we're like, fair warning. This is the darkest.
And then we're laughing.
But then we're like, but it's so good. You got to read it, but not really.
There are several scenes that deal with defecation, and we will just leave it at that. But those scenes were a lot for me. They were a lot. With the boot, I just couldn't. And then later on, I just, yeah. So I guess at this point we should probably say we're going to get into some spoilers.
Spoilers.
Okay, so, yeah, Kevin, I agree. I did not like what Blix did to Anna.
Yeah, that broke my heart for Anna.
Yeah,
Anna had it bad. You know, she just had the worst luck ever. I just felt so bad for her.
I mean, she was moments from freedom. She had pretty much survived the workhouse unscathed. I mean, relatively. And then she's attacked.
Yeah.
She's ends up getting pregnant from that one attack, and you know, she can't even fathom, you know, having a child from that. And Blix, I thought Blix was going to be her knight in shining armor. I just thought for a minute that he was going to help her. And even after he didn't agree to help her try to, you know, get the concoction and get, you know, rid of the pregnancy, I thought he was going to help her raise this child. He was going to help her through this. And then to commit suicide. I mean, just, you know, I mean, at least I do feel still a sense of just deep sympathy for him, because I feel like he was trying to have some sort of recompense for what he had done. You know, the fact that he had participated in the, you know, brutal torture and dismemberment of this man. And his way of doing that, you know, was through Anna, which, you know, very self-serving, but still, I kind of like, I'm like, his heart was kind of in the right place. I think he was trying to do what he thought.
Very, very symbolic. Maybe we could have done with a little less symbolism, Blix, but
yeah. I mean, she was in a better place when he left. I mean, she was married, so her child was not going to grow up with that title of bastard. But she's alone. I mean, I thought they were kind of kindred spirits because they'd both been so traumatized. I thought that they would help each other through the dark. And
I thought that too.
That, so I mean,
okay. And then the sad thing is, we keep hoping that there would be a glimmer of light in this book, and there just wasn't.
There wasn't ever.
There just really wasn't. But it was so good. Read it. No, don't read it.
It was great. It was great. You will get justice, though. You will get justice. But it actually, you know, I was really shocked by who the killer was. Like, I was sure that the killer was somehow connected to that little secret society of philanthropists.
Yeah, that's one of my drawbacks in this book, is that it felt very random on who the killer was. You know, like I don't think we had met them before or anything like that. And that was one thing I didn't like. I would have kind of liked, uh, if it was like the old police chief or something, like seedy like that. But that was one thing that towards the end of the book, I kind of got a little confused because I'm like, wait, who's this guy? He met who?
Right.
What they do? And right before we went on, I actually asked Carrie. I was like, did I think of the ending correctly? Is this like what this was about? And that was one thing that I didn't like about the book because it just seemed very, very random and a little bit flimsy with some of like the background information, and things didn't quite make sense. Which maybe that's the point. It wasn't supposed to make sense. It was kind of this weird, senseless time type of thing. But that's one drawback of the book for me.
Well, and when I got to the end, I think I was a little bit. I was shocked that the society didn't have anything to do with the actual murder, but I was kind of okay with how it ended because I saw how it sets up for a sequel. Like, I definitely see the sequel as addressing that secret society. Like, I feel like that is the group of criminals we're going to go after next. And it will be easy to tie them into what's already been done because they did, house the victim towards the end of his life and used him as basically entertainment. And yeah, that just thinking about that, just like gives me a reaction.
That I actually messaged you and I was like, I have to stop reading for this.
Yeah,
because I just for a few days I couldn't do that.
Yeah,
that's not good me.
Like I'm having a reaction in my mouth. I'm like
the whole thing. Yeah. We don't need to get into it. Just it's the whole thing. Like,
if you read the book, you'll understand. You'll understand why I'm like.
And then
trying not to gag. I'm trying not to gag.
And then you wish you didn't read it. And it's like, what did you do to me, Carrie and Jane?
Yeah.
But it's a good book.
Oh, look who showed up.
Book time with Elvis. Hi.
The person we hold responsible for all of this. Well, we've actually, Mark, we've already mentioned your name. We did talk about you a little bit. Jane and I both really enjoyed this book, and we keep talking about how gory it was, how disturbing it was, these awful reactions we had to certain scenes, and then in the second breath we keep trying to convince people to read this book.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It makes more sense if you read the book.
Yes. And yeah, I agree, Kevin. I think there is maybe in the sequel they'll explore that connection a little bit more. Because they did. The murderer, his father was connected to that group.
Yeah.
Because
there's a lot
he was
in that
taken
group anyway. So
he was taken to that brothel, house of horrors, really, because people assumed that he was into the strange and weird debauchery that his father was in. Anne said it's both the best book and the worst book.
That's it. And Anne said it. That's all we need to say. It's the best book and the worst book. Perfect way to put that.
That's the tagline
it's
for this
like
video.
I'm getting mixed messages. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Oh.
Gosh, that's funny.
One thing I want to say I read in like one of the discussion questions somewhere in the back, and there was a quote in one of the questions, and I don't know if it was one of the quotes in the book or what, but the quote was, "Violence begets violence." And how do you see that kind of relating to the plot of the book?
I actually think that's pretty integral to the entire book. You can see, I'm going to take for the characters of Anna and Blix for this, but you can argue that what Blix was made to do is violence against him as well, because it's violence against his mentality and his emotional well-being, and really just psychologically. It's violent to put somebody in that situation. And then he turns around and, his taking advantage of Anna's situation is causing misery on her part, which you could define as violence for the sake of this discussion. And then, obviously his demise could be construed as violence against himself as well in order to escape this mentality. So I definitely see that illustrated in his character, because somebody, put him in a really, really bad situation. It had a ripple effect and it began violence in that way. Um, and a little bit too with Anna, but I wanted to hear what you think first.
I'm going to go with Anna. Let me go with that one because I
Yeah.
think that one is not quite as overt as some of the other characters. Obviously, Anna experiences violence and she's violently attacked. And unfortunately, I think that, often circles back and has a ripple effect, because, even though this child, she wanted to rid herself of this child, and that could be seen as an act of
Mhm.
violence. She also had the violent attack, which Kevin's mentioning, where she threw acid all over
Mhm.
the man he was trying to extort, from her. So I mean, you could get into, justice and all of that sort of thing, but I think it's always a slippery slope, right?
Mhm.
It's always, I think, when you are the victim of violence, it is easy to fall into the trap of justifying each act that
Mhm.
you perpetrate as some sort of retribution or justice, whether it is or not. Hurt people,
I think
unfortunately.
I think that also no other better character displays us than the murderer as
Yes,
well.
that childhood of his
That
was
was rough. That whole
horrific,
situation was rough. This whole book was rough.
horrific.
Yeah.
And then the connection between, I
Yeah.
can't even, I'm almost having trouble even talking about what happens with his mother. But his
Yeah.
mother was, mentally handicapped to the point where she was nonverbal. She could not get out of the bed. She, essentially was bedridden and uncommunicative. I mean, not even like signaling with blinks or anything like that for most of her life. And um, her father allows her to get married to save the family estate,
Yeah.
and she ends up getting pregnant, which, that was not consensual because she didn't have the ability to consent. So then she's having to give birth to this child who ends up being our murderer in the book. And he, craves attention and craves connection to someone. His father is wackadoodle and he doesn't give it to him. And so he ends up sneaking into his mother's room and discovering, the family secret. And she has violent outbursts against him, which again, it's probably a reaction of to the violence that has been perpetrated
Yep.
against her. Now she's taking it
Yep.
out on whoever's nearby and attacking the flies.
Yeah.
She's
That
literally
was
pulling the, appendages off of the fly and leaving it to die and struggle in the windowsill, and how the murderer uses that same method. It just, oh, it was
yeah. It was.
rough.
It was. It was. But again, it was so random too because I'm like, wait, who are you? Like,
Yeah, who is this guy?
yeah. And there's like this whole other storyline going on that we had no idea about until like the very end.
But I mean, I'm guessing it's going to play in the sequel, and I think Kevin's right. I guess that will play into this group because his father was from a prominent family, right? And
Mhm.
that family is kind of struggling to keep assets. And early on in the book, they don't talk about it, a ton, but early on in the book, they talk about this group being very strict with its members, that they had dues they had to pay, and if they could not pay their dues, that the group would go after them and seize assets and really just destroy them. So I wonder if that's what happened to his father.
Maybe.
Because we know his father frequented the little clubhouse, whatever you want to call it, that clubhouse, house of horrors. Yeah. Yeah. So there's got to be a connection there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think kind of like in the story also kind of reminded me of Ripper Street, if you've ever seen that with Matthew McFadden. No, well, basically it follows a very similar timeline where a bunch of small crimes actually lead up to, oh, there's a big crime going on. So I think maybe that this structure is going to have a very similar one where now they've solved, a little crime, but they're going to see like this whole different underbelly of the city.
Yeah, I think you're right. The city was really a character. I mean, I really think the city was a character in this book.
It was gritty. It was just as gritty as some of the situations.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. That's another thing that I really appreciated, that the author talked a lot about like miasma theory and about like how people thought about medicine and health back then as well, which is pretty much that they didn't, but okay. And so that's something that I haven't seen in a lot of books, like this whole idea that like the fumes in the air will make you sick, and like it's so different than like what we have now as germ theory. I thought that was a really interesting thing to put into this book, because everybody was like afraid of like, well, don't breathe the air, or don't go to that part of town and breathe the air because that's how you get sick. And seeing that type of historical account in this book was really interesting for me.
Yeah, I was really nervous for Christopher Blix, because what I thought was going to happen, because he was very inexperienced. I mean, he wasn't a surgeon. He essentially apprenticed with a surgeon during the war, and it didn't sound like he had much hands-on experience. He just kind of watched another surgeon, do his work, and that was it. And I was thinking to myself, okay, this guy is telling him he has to cut off one limb after the other, and he has to basically nurse this victim whilst doing these acts and make sure he doesn't die. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is gonna die. And then we're gonna find out later in the book, Christopher Blix's body is gonna pop up because this guy's gonna kill him. I thought for a second it was gonna be a vicious cycle that, this guy was going to die, and then when he died, Christopher was going to be the victim, and our murderer would bring in somebody else. Like,
that's what I thought too.
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to how random this whole thing was. The fact that we were thinking it was going to be something like that. Like, I never would have guessed the motivations of this killer at all.
Which maybe it still could be, because didn't you say that the group says you have to like pay your dues or do your things, stuff like that? So maybe that type of thinking is actually going to play out maybe in the next book.
Yeah, that's true. So Mark lived in Stockholm. Glad it wasn't like that. Yeah. Let the Right One In. I read that a few months ago as well. And actually I read that with Mark. I think it was Summer actually did a group read of that, and that one was really disturbing to me as well. And it must be something about the Swedish vibes. I don't know. They do dark really well. They do dark really well. But the character in that book, the point at which he really disturbed me, like I wasn't scared until, and this kind of connects to this book, he throws acid on himself to disfigure himself before the police are about to arrest him. And so he ends up still trying to attack people and escapes from the hospital and all the stuff. And it's at that point when this character is like so mangled and he's like not able really to communicate, and it's like his humanity has been taken from him, And I think
Wow.
that's the scariest thing for me. So
Yeah.
when our victim here, when I felt that way about him, it just, I don't know, it
Yeah.
made me feel creeped out. I don't
Yeah.
know.
What really saddened me is that, and I won't go into too many details, but the victim does something pretty horrific to try to maintain his identity for finding out like who killed him or who did this to him. And I remember I messaged you and I was like, Carrie, I can't, because even through all of this torture, through all this, people don't know if he's like even a person at this point. He still had something in him that drove him to try to be
Mm-hmm.
remembered and do some really, really hard things in order to do that. And I'm tearing up now. I can't think about that. That was probably the hardest part of the book for me is that image of somebody who's gone through so much, but still has that one little tiny piece of hope that something's going to happen to help, even if he's not here for it. That, and I'm crying. I'm crying. I'm crying because of it right now. Um, that
So here,
was. Go ahead.
a little life didn't make you cry, but this did.
This one did. This one did. So yeah, Carrie, we have to like lighten it up a little bit. Like we just read a little life. We read this one. Carrie, I don't think I can take much more of this. I'm
You know, but
joking.
we're still laughing, we're still smiling, we're still having a
Yeah,
great time. So I think we will recover.
that's
But
true. But I'm just
yeah,
like we've read the two like those horrific books back to back. Like we are in this to win this.
you know, we're working on our mental toughness every day. Stay hard. That's what
That's
David
right.
Goggins would say. All
That's right.
right. um, yeah, I agree with you about how what the victim was able to do. You know, I think it was a reminder to the reader that, like, hey, there's a person in there
Yeah.
because, you know, I mean, his eyes had been removed, his tongue had been taken out, you know, all of that. And I think the other characters in the book were treating him like an it. You know,
Yeah.
they were treating him like an animal.
Yeah.
They were treating him worse than an animal. We treat our animals pretty good, but they were treating him just so inhumanely. It just it was just that stark reminder that yes, there is a person here, and the intestinal fortitude, literally, that it took to do what he had to do in order to try to get some sort of justice after his death, you know, some sort of recognition of who he was or who killed him. I can't imagine, like, I'm just reading that thinking I would have given up like
Yeah.
long ago. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure, I'm sure there are cases with people who are kidnapped and people who, you know, are murdered where stuff like this still happens, where people are able to somehow leave behind these clues. And I'm just in awe of it because I just cannot fathom it.
Yeah, I agree. And funny enough, I actually think that sentiment, I think you're right about that. It's a reminder that the victim is a person. Um, I think that sentiment was also kind of peaked at when they gave him a name. Remember, instead of just calling him the victim, they gave
Yeah.
him even just a made up name. I really liked that detail because it brought a little bit of the humanity to the situation when we were first meeting his remains. So I thought that was really interesting that you said that because I picked up on that when in the opening scene with Cecil and Cardell.
Yeah. And I think that too made me like that duo,
Yeah,
you know, from the start, because I was like, oh, here they are. And they're really thinking about this victim. Like, they're really thinking about, because you know, I don't remember exactly how the body was described, but you know, I can imagine it was in a pretty severe state of decomp, and you know, it would have been easy for them to, you know, oh well, there's no clues here, and what do we do? You know, like it's the 1790s, so it's not like they have a lot to go on.
and a
Um,
lot of resources too.
yeah, I mean, you think about, even high profile murders like Jack the Ripper murders. And even with those murders, very few clues really to go on. And these guys just keep at it. Like, I, and some of the clues were pretty thin. I mean, I think the first major clue was like a piece of cloth.
Yeah.
They tracked down a merchant,
Yeah.
it was
Not
a
a lot to
wild
go
ride.
on.
Yeah, it was a wild ride. Yeah, Mark and Ann said 3 Men in a Boat. We should read that. That is a great book. It's
Is
a
that
great,
like a happy
actually.
book, or is it?
It is. It's really happy.
All
It's
right.
really funny. There's a whole section with cheese, if I remember correctly, Mark.
Well,
Is
that's
that
exciting.
3 Men in a
Well,
Boat?
you sold me on the cheese. You
There's a
sold
whole
me.
section with cheese. Yeah, super funny and very lighthearted. I actually read that with Mark. I think that's Mark's favorite book, if I remember right. So he had a lot of cool, interesting things in that group read. So yeah. Well, I guess, is there anything else that you would like to say about this book, Jane?
I know we've talked about that this book is very shocking and very like gruesome and everything, but I want to also reiterate that it was a beautifully written book and it is a really, really deep book. So it may not be for everyone. Definitely do your homework. And if you don't think it's for you, that's okay. That's totally fine. But if you can stomach it, I do think that this is a very, very interesting book to have added onto the bookshelves. What do you think, Karen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you are looking for something that you want to put down and is very fast paced and
You won't
very
forget it.
thrilling, and you haven't really been moved by much, if you're like me and you're pretty stoic about the books that you read, I mean, A Little Life really didn't
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah, that didn't do anything.
If you're one of those people and you're like, man, I can read just about anything, I think you'll be okay with this one, and I think you will like it. I would be surprised if you had read anything like this. I don't know. It's so different from anything I've ever read.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see the sequel. I'm interested to see. Did it come out already, or did it come out like
I
in
think
January?
it is out, if I remember right. I think Mark had
I think it was
said
like
it was
just a couple
coming
days
out.
ago, right?
Yeah.
Like 17th
Yeah,
or something.
I would be interested. I mean, I can't imagine that this is a one-off just because of the way this author writes. I mean, it's such a very vivid, immersive experience. And yeah, I can't imagine that this is just a one-time, one-hit wonder. Like, I would be interested in this sequel. And I'm not someone who loves like series a ton. But this is a one I would want to continue. And Mark actually says there are 3 parts out. So it's a trilogy.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
But the English translation was only 1 or 2 years ago. Gotcha.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Steven, I don't know. I don't know if you can handle this book. You might want to.
Yeah, I don't know. Read up on Goodreads first.
you might.
Caution.
I think you've gotten probably enough from this live show. You can probably skip it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mark says part 3 is not out in English yet. So
okay. Yep.
Nice.
So did they just do part 2? I think they just did part 2 in English.
Yes. He said,
cool.
Yeah, not too long ago.
Cool.
All right. Well, Jane, this was lovely.
It was such a way to ring in 2023. I'm so I honestly am happy that I could be the co-host for this month's Buddy Read with that. So thank you so much for asking me. I had a great time.
Thank you for reading this with me. I feel like you're my go-to now for any disturbing book that I need to read.
Yeah.
We tag team it. We're there for moral support, and we always get through it just fine.
We do. And then we're like, it's a great book.
So there you go. All right. Well, thank you to everybody who showed up and chatted with us in the chat. I hope you guys have a fantastic, phenomenal, top-notch, tremendous super duper splendid, stupendous kind of weekend. And I gave you that outro because that's what I usually say to my students every day at school. I use a ton of adjectives at the end of every class. And now I have set a precedent. So I have to, like, you know, come up with all these wonderful adjectives. So if you guys have any good adjectives that I need to use, leave me a comment with those. I like when they kind of go in a line. So I like to use all my S ones together. And yeah, kind of flows a little bit better. But yeah. Mark says I'm here all week for more recommendations.
Thanks, Mark. We'll call you. Don't worry.
You know, I think Mark was a little bit scared the first week we started reading the book, because I remember I was really busy that week, so I hadn't done a ton of reading.
And everyone was really quiet reading.
Yeah. So then he sends me a message.
No chat notifications.
Yeah. And it's just to me, and he's like, I'm just checking in to see how the book's going. So I think he was a little worried that, you know, he had you know, severed some relationships with this recommendation. But Mark, we're friends for life, bud. Even if you give me a bad recommendation one day, we're all good. But I have to say, all of your recommendations have been top notch. So
that's true. That is true. Yeah, I really enjoyed this too. It wasn't what I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was a very, very good book and a very interesting reading experience. So thank you for the recommendation, Mark.
All right. Well, you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time, Jane. We'll have to coordinate next time. I'll make sure to wear my black.
Yes, sounds good. And I'll wear blue, and then it'll be really awkward.
There we go. All right. Bye, guys.